Yeah, thank you. Good to see you, and thank you that I'm able to present that topic today at lunchtime. So hopefully you guys enjoy Teams Fest right now, and I really enjoy being part of it and also bring a random topic to your attention because, or let me first start with an introduction. So my name is Martina Grom. I'm an Office 365 MVP or a Microsoft 365 MVP, as well as an Azure MVP. And I'm located in Vienna in Austria, and I work with Microsoft Cloud Services since a couple of years now. And what I do mostly currently is I do a lot of compliance and security. I also do a lot of security audits for various customers around Microsoft 365. And I always get questions from customers how they can solve different scenarios. And one of those scenarios brought me literally to the idea for that session today around what is the use case for information barriers, when should I use it, what is a good use case, what should I look after it, what is a best practice that I learned in my actual project, and what can I accomplish with using information barriers within Microsoft 365 and especially within Microsoft Teams. So I fill in a little agenda about that. So the first start we will do here is why and where should we use information barriers. So I just want to clarify, or the most impact or the learning you should have after that session is that you get a good knowledge about information barriers, the use cases, why you should use it, where you should use it, and probably also why you shouldn't use it because you just thought it's a good idea and it isn't, and you can solve it in another way. So also what I will show you today is what are the prerequisites to have information barriers in your tenant and how to use it. And then we will walk through the configuration of a typical setup, what you can do there, how to set it up, how to segment users. And the last point will be results and lessons learned, that we go through that and see what we will accomplish with the setup of information barriers. So first thing is, why and where should we use information barriers? And I just want to talk about that. So the why is, and why was it set up by Microsoft, is information barriers. It prevents individuals in your tenant to communicate with each other. So it's a very typical use case. If you look at the financial industry, for instance, where they said, okay, we are in a single tenant scenario, but we have two specific teams who are not allowed out of legal or compliance reasons to talk to each other. How can I accomplish that? So for instance, a use case could be insider trade. Within a bank, this could happen because people talk, you know how it works. And to have it in a compliant way that every regulator would accept there, you might need to set up information barriers to prevent individuals in your tenant to communicate with each other. On the other side, it also brings you to the situation, you do not need to set up information barriers if you just don't want individuals to talk to each other. Very often, communication is king. Also, if you need to isolate specific users within your tenant, and this is another example which was brought to me in one of my first projects I had. It was a large company who migrated from Lotus Notes into Microsoft 365. I think probably it was still BPOS. And the requirement we had back then was that they said we have a research team, and the research team within our organization is not allowed to talk to anyone else. It's just because of our compliance rules. We do not want them to talk with the others. We do not want them to share information and so on. And because it was a very early project, information barriers weren't invented that time back. And it was an email migration from Notes to Exchange Online. We did that with email policies back then. That brings me to the next point. Information barriers is currently supported in Microsoft Teams and also in SharePoint and OneDrive. And that means if you have Teams user where you want them to to talk to each other, to share meetings or anything else, you can do that for Teams, you can do that for SharePoint, you can do that for OneDrive, but it doesn't apply to email communication yet. So the setup for information barriers, it's specifically Teams only currently. You can set it up for SharePoint and OneDrive as well, but you can't apply it to email. If you want to apply it to email, you can do that with an email result, but you have to build it by yourself. And also, what might be interesting, if you are deep into compliance in Microsoft 365, information barriers work independently from compliance boundaries. So if you have set up that, it doesn't imply into information barriers. And the next topic would be information barriers are based on Exchange address policies. I think many of you know Exchange Online is the oldest service within the Microsoft 365 suite. It's a very mature and stable service, and also information barriers rely on Exchange address policies. That's a good thing, because for those who are familiar with setting up Exchange address policies, they can look into it and configure it. The bad thing, or the not so nice thing around that, is that if you have already Exchange address policies in place, you can't use information barriers. So it's an either or decision. And from an access right, because, and I need to highlight that, we need to go away from that. Everyone is a global administrator in our tenant due to security reason. If you go into a least privileged scenario with your users and administrator, there is a new role. And this is also something I wanted to highlight here. It's called Microsoft Information Barrier Compliance Manager, and he can set up the rule set. He is allowed to manage that. And that's the only thing he needs to do. Please give him only that compliance manager role. The other available roles, of course, it's global admin, compliance manager, and so on. But if you go least privilege, which would be my recommendation, use the information barrier compliance manager role. And also to highlight that again, I'm sure there's a session about that. Please also go into PIM and use your admin roles only with PIM access. It helps you a lot in security. So from the use cases, it's the first one, and this is probably the most important one, and this is also the use case where information barriers came from, was the financial industry. So the requirement there was here that the FINRA said, okay, we need to have a compliance rule set in place that keeps our users in one tenant, but definitely split them up. Otherwise, we have to set up multiple tenants, and we do need to set up a rule set manually with multiple tenants. People cannot communicate to each other and so on. And you can solve that with setting up information barriers in your tenant. A second one could be education. And education is currently also kind of the same scenario. So consider you are not one school or one university, you are the tenant administrator of a couple of schools, of a couple of universities. And you want to prevent that the different schools can see each other, or that they can communicate to each other, and so on. So this could be a use case as well. Another use case could be that you said, okay, within education, I do not want our teachers talk to the students, or vice versa. That you said, okay, I do not want my students to talk to teachers, or I do not want my students to talk to the school administrators. So it could be that those kind of use cases which are out of the education space. And the most popular one is one tenant, multiple education entities like universities and school. Legal. Consider a case where you are a lawyer and your colleague is a lawyer as well, and both of you get involved in a legal case at the opposite parties. So that means you have an insider risk, which you need to cover. You shouldn't talk about the case with your colleague. You shouldn't share information because from a lawyer perspective, you have to be with your customer or with your client, and you need to defend the interests of your clients. So this could be a use case out of legal departments. Government, kind of the same story. Consider a government agency. You need to split them up. It's a single tenant scenario. You need to split up the communication flows between different entities with them. And also don't get me wrong, because I always mention it's a single tenant scenario and multiple entities in there. Information barriers is not there to split up a tenant into entities. The use case is always the same. You use information barriers to prevent communication between different entities, so they can't communicate to each other. In services, it's kind of the same scenario. In services, you can have a situation, and this is what I had there, that you have a situation where you have one tenant and you have multiple customers which are working, or multiple vendors or customers or anything else who work together in your tenant. And you want to prevent that they see each other and that they communicate with each other. That would be an information barrier use case as well. On the other side, if we look at the services scenario I just outlined to you, it could also be possible if you have that scenario that you are working with guests and you want them to work together in teams, you have to split them up into different teams, and you use guest access and also entitlement management and those things to manage the guest access here, and also try to implement a good Azure B2B lifecycle policy for your guests as well. Research, on the other side, as I already outlined there, and I see that very often across all industries. Very often you have research departments in your organization which needs to be protected from the rest of the organization, or the rest of the organization needs to be protected from the research organization. You just have to prevent them from sharing your intellectual property, talk too much, forward emails, and so on to stay compliant, and you just don't want to do that. Also, scenarios could be, I had that with another client where they said, okay, our research department is allowed to speak to the rest, but we need the moderation on that. We need to know what they are talking and what they are doing. Customer connections, I already highlighted that. It could be the case that you have a connection between a lot of customers and they come together into a tenant. Also here, consider before you go into information barriers, consider, is guest access enough? Can I live with that? Can I split them up in different teams and different channels? Can I manage them from there? Or do I really have this scenario where I thought, okay, I also don't want that they talk to each other and have the customer connections in place. And the last one, and this is one of the most popular for me right now, because I'm working on a use case with a customer here. Consider we have a global pandemic and nobody is allowed to travel anymore. And you are in engineering and you need to assist your customers with your construction stuff, your manufacturing site and so on, but you can't travel. So the Dynamics team invented a couple of years ago the solution, it's Remote Assist. Remote Assist gives you your mobile phone with a Remote Assist client, or you can wear a HoloLens, which means the expert is, for instance, in London, and the customer, for instance, is in Vienna, and they connect through the Remote Assist app on the HoloLens. And the expert then can show his customer how to fix the engineering side remotely. And this solves a lot of use cases. So first of all, you can't travel. You can still be with your customer. You can still assist your customer. And on the other side, if you have a HoloLens in place, a HoloLens works with an internal service account. And you probably don't want that the HoloLenses talk to each other, those service accounts. And that means in those scenarios, you also have to set up information barriers to split up the different scenarios of your customers who all have the Remote Assist HoloLenses in place and to work with those use cases. And I like that use case a lot because it solves a lot of current requirements. And I see the interest of customers growing around how can we use Remote Assist, what is a good use case, and so on. And I came to that topic accidentally because the customer I'm working with, they said, okay, we need to make the access with the HoloLenses in a very secure way. So I came there, looked at that scenario out of a security perspective, and the solution was setting up information barriers to just prevent the people to talk with each other, to open chats and so on, to stay compliant within the customer tenant. So it could be a good use case for you if you are into Remote Assist. What are the prerequisites to set up Microsoft information barriers? And the fun part, and I simply start with the money, as always, is licenses. So you need to have compliance licenses or E5 licensed in there to use information barriers. But on the other side, if you have a legal requirement that you said, okay, I need to be compliant, I have a regulator to do that, you have to just add those compliance licenses to your tenant, and then you can set up information barriers. The second thing you need to consider here, it only supports two-way restrictions. So it's not enough to just license one way, because if you want to prevent sales talking to marketing, both needs licenses and not only one way. Okay, also consider that in your planning around information barriers. And the second point in a preparation call is look at your organizational structure, because this must be reflected within your Azure Active Directory. What does that mean? You need to segment your users. We will look at that later. And if you do not have any information filled in Azure Active Directory, like extension attributes, organizations, departments, groups, or anything else, you can't segment your users to set up information barriers. Very often I talk with customers and they have customized what they sent over to Azure Active Directory due to whatever reasons they had. And if you are not syncing those attribute fields, you can't set up information barriers in a proper way. Then the first thing you have to do if you set it up, you have to enable scope directory search in the Microsoft Teams Admin Center. I will show you that later. And before you haven't set it up, you can't run any PowerShell or configuration because it simply won't work. Also, another recommendation would be please enable audit logging. On newer tenants, it's enabled, but it could be that you have an older tenant already and you did disable audit logging for whatever reason. Please double check that if it's enabled, because then you can look, are my policies working? What can I do? Also from a compliance perspective, if you have a regulator or an auditor looking into that, you have to show him how your information barriers works, and this is the way to go through audit logging. I already mentioned that if you have set up address policies, Exchange address book policies, you need to make a decision. Do you want to stay with your address book policies, or do you want to set up information barriers? They can't work together. And you need, for the configuration, the Microsoft 365 Compliance Center. And to be totally transparent, you do the whole configuration through PowerShell. And you need the security and compliance PowerShell, the Exchange Remote PowerShell, because as I mentioned, it's based on Exchange, and also the Azure PowerShell commandlet. And you need to be an admin to run it within Microsoft Teams. And the last point here is also what I learned here. If you set up information barriers, you need time to set it up. So for instance, if you set up the scope directory search within the Teams admin center, wait at least a couple of hours to make sure it's replicated everywhere, it's enabled everywhere, and so on. And you will also see if you change one of the policies, it could take up to 30 minutes or longer to be replicated everywhere and reflected in your policies. So how do you do the configuration and how to start that? And this is the last slide before we go into the demo. Is the first step would be, I need to segment my users. And the most crucial part here, and this is also, it can get very complicated, especially if you have a lot of users. Think about that thoroughly, how to do that, but you need to segment your users, and every user can only be in one segment. And when I first walked through the information barriers, I thought about, okay, segmentation by department, it's not a good thing. But the longer I think about that, I think it's a configuration or a segmentation by department is actually a good idea, because a user is only part of one department from an Azure Active Directory perspective. And so it reduces the errors if you set it up, because the second crucial part here is you can't overlap the segmentation. So that means if you have a segment between marketing and retail, the user can't be part of both teams. It doesn't work that way. So no overlap here. And this is also, if you consider using information barriers, think about that, because you can also set it up based on security groups, for instance, and errors happen very easily if you said, okay, I'm moving the user from this group to another group and this group and whatever. If you have an overlap created, it won't work anymore. And the second part would be, after that, you define your information barrier policies, and then you apply the information barrier policies, and the walkthrough through that. It's not a lot to do from a PowerShell perspective, but it will still take you one day because of the delays between the policies and that everything is set up and runs. That being said, we just jumping over to a demo to show you how to set it up and what the first steps are. I'm just jumping over, and I will walk you through the steps here. So what you see here, probably see here now, it's a little bit better, is these are your first processes. So first of all, you need to connect to the tenant. You also see I go into Exchange Online Management, and I use that. I use a demo tenant to configure that. And also I need the new Azure model. I have already pre-installed that because that's why it's not active here. And then I have to connect to Azure Active Directory for my authentication. And then the next step would be, your first one is you need to run a flow which gives the application consent that you can set up, or you are allowed to set up information barriers in your tenant. And before you do that, the first step would be, please go into your tenant, where you are an administrator there. Looking if I already timed out because I talked so much. Still working. So the first step would be go into your Teams admin center. And from the Teams admin center, please go to your org-wide settings and then follow the path to Team settings. This is really the first thing you need to do if you set up information barriers, and then scroll down and open up the scoped policies. So scope directory search with an Exchange address book policy and turn that on. The default setting here is off, so you have to turn it on. And also another practical tip here would be, please turn it on and wait at least a couple of hours that it's really synchronized everywhere, replicated everywhere, and then you can start working with your PowerShells. And the second tip I would give you, please open up a demo tenant first, try how it works, think about the segmentation, and afterwards move it to your production tenant. Otherwise, you probably have errors and troubleshooting steps to follow, which are not necessary from the beginning. Okay, so first step doing that. And then I'm going back to my admin center and I look at my users. I have here 2 users, it's Adele and Alex. And if I look at Adele, so my goal would be, I want to prevent to have, if I go here, I look into the contact information. Adele works in the retail department, and I want to prevent marketing talking to retail. So that would mean the segmentation I'm doing is based on the department, not the security group, nothing else. It's just based on the department. Looking there, the second person, checking here for Alex, and Alex also from a communication perspective, he is part of the marketing department. And you see, those are the 2 departments. I do not want that they talk to each other, because why should retail talk with marketing? So this is what we are going to do. And now we go back to our PowerShell. And I already connected to the tenant, and I also already did set up my app allowance policies. So everything is set. The first step, and this is a good thing, I will share the links to that later. Microsoft built an information barrier workbook where you can look at all the segments here. Let me just enlarge it a little bit for you, where you can see, okay, run these commands in your PowerShell to add information barriers to your tenant. And the first step would be, first of all, I need to create my segments and my policies. So as I already mentioned, I want to prevent marketing talk to retail. So first thing is I will add a segment name, so it's marketing. The filter attribute I have here is department. You can look at any extension attribute you have filled into your Azure Active Directory. But as I already mentioned, the department makes kind of sense to have it filtered that way, but you can also use any extension attribute you might think about that. Then you have a filter operator, and you can set, okay, it's either equal or not equal. So you can also set it up there, and you see my filter attribute is marketing. And then you see I have here my PowerShell, which is printed out, and I simply can go there and copy it here, let it run, hope that I'm not timed out, and it's running then against my tenant. And when I do that, you will see he's creating the new PowerShell setting. I was already authenticated. It's running against that, and then it will process the PowerShell commandlet. And that means I have now my marketing segment started here. And the second one would be just to show you the output. This is what I get. First segment is department equal marketing. Who created that? When was it created? And you see it's an object state new, and it's currently set up. So my second one would be, and back to my Excel sheet, is retail. So all users which are part of the retail department are in my second segment. So I set that up, let it run, and then you see, okay, we have now segmented our users. So that means Adele and Alex Wilber are now in two separate segments. They still can talk to each other because we haven't activated any policy yet, but we have already segmented them the right way. Again, think about that, no overlap, no double groups or anything else, and make it not too complicated. Also, another recommendation would be, if you have decided to go with a filter attribute department, stay with that. Don't start to mix it up. Okay, once I take department, the other one I take extension attributes, the third one I take the organization name. You will just end in a lot of troubleshooting, I promise. And you will spend a lot of time to figure out what is happening and how you can do that. And then we have our policies. And you see, my policy is I want to assign marketing, and it's blocked to retail, and it's a two-way scenario. You can see you can set it up one way or two-way, and you can also activate it immediately. Also, could be a good recommendation that you start first with setting up the policy, but not activating it. Or you just say, okay, I'm sure I do the right thing. I do that every day. I set it to active immediately. And then you see, how does your PowerShell look like? Back to that. And you see here, the policy is marketing to retail with my two segments. And also it's already set to active. Just running the commandlet, setting it up. And the second one, while the commandlet runs, because we have a two-way scenario, we go there and said, okay, we need it the other way around as well. And also the next thing here, what you see here, your changes will take into effect after you start the application. It doesn't have any impact yet because we haven't run that, we haven't started that, so you are safe to go here. Second commandlet, and then we go through that. So another example would be if you go setting up the policies first. This is a great help to have that Excel sheet. I would wish Microsoft does that a lot more often to help people learn about how they structure their PowerShells and how do they do that. And also what you can do afterwards, you can also say, okay, I want to set up the policy for marketing to retail is inactive. So you can also set it up that way. And also you can change the status, like marketing was set up as an inactive policy. Then you can set, okay, I want to have to activate that. Okay, so back to our PowerShell commandlet, and you see we have it now in here, we have set it up. And then the next point would be, we would start the information barrier policies application. And that means as soon as I run that, it will start the whole process. And what I've learned here while doing that setup in here, you see the status, it's not started. And this status stays that way for around 30 minutes, 1 hour, or even longer. So it's always something you need to consider, how it looks like, and so on. So back to the presentation, because I only have 40 minutes and not 1 hour, is I made some screenshots how it looks like when the policies are set up and how it looks like. So let me just jump to the first slide. So the first slide would be, we want to have, or just first go to the outcome. What we have currently set up, we prevented 2 departments to communicate with each other. But the first one would also be, I'm unable to search for those users. So I do not even see them in the tenant. So I can't search for them, even if I know the email address, I can't contact them. I also I'm not able to add a member to a team from a group I'm not allowed to talk to. I can't also starting chat sessions with them. And I also can't ask a third person, can you please start a group chat with people from the marketing and retail department that we can chat together. It's not working that way because information barriers are in place right now. Also, you are unable to invite someone to a meeting, so you can't add persons, or you also are unable to call the persons. You can't add screen or file sharing or anything else. How does it look like? So it's kind of a speed forward. So what we see here, I'm not able to add information barriers members, so we do not find any matches. So the message you get from a user perspective is probably not the correct one, because the person is in your tenant, but you as a user are not seeing them. And so you get the current error message here. Also, if you want to chat with one, you also see here, we do not find any matches for those people and we do not see them. The second one would be if you have a call with a person. So for instance, I'm Adele. I'm invited to a call with the marketing department where Alex is part of, and we are not allowed to. We are not able to join those calls. So the user also gets a notification that the company policy prevents you from joining this call. And also from a Teams chat, and this is also kind of a bumpy part, if you set up a information barrier policy afterwards, it could happen in your Teams tenant that people who were allowed to talk to each other are not allowed to talk to each other anymore. And those are removed from chats, from Teams, and so on. And this can also cause some errors in your environment. So as you see, for instance, there is a chat between Ellen and other persons, and then you see, okay, you get a notification that the administrator has disabled the communication flow for those users. So also consider that if you're planning that and if you're setting that up. That being said, my lessons learned around how to communicate and how to set up information barriers policies. I always, before I start an information barrier policy, I get with the customer through their use cases. Very often, I think about different ways how we can solve that, how we can probably avoid to set up information barriers policies. Please double check the requirements. Very often, it's probably just too complicated thinking in the first beginning, and you can find a way with guest access, access reviews, entitlement management, or other things around identities. So please double check that. The second learning I had is please take your time for setup. It's not only because you have the setup here with a delay in replication or anything else. It's also, you have to think about segmentation and how you do that and how it's worth doing that. And the last point is please think and define your segments properly, that you have no overlap and so on. In the presentation, I used a couple of information which I collected here in the links. You will get the presentation afterwards. A link to the Excel workbook, how to set it up with SharePoint and OneDrive, how to troubleshoot it, how to go there and how to set it up. And also, please connect if you want to follow me on Twitter. You can simply use that barcode. If you want to connect to me through LinkedIn, simply set it up with that barcode. And I'm happy to talk about anything related to that session. Just ask me. I'm not very responsive on email, to be frank, but probably through Twitter, you have more luck on that. That being said, 40 minutes. Please rate the session. Attend more sessions, watch the keynotes at the end. And thank you for joining the call. I hope it was interesting and I hope you learned something new. Thank you.